I think what we really see is sort of a back to the future sort of analogy here, where NATO is back to what it was founded for, which was in 1949 about European security, about deterring the potential Soviet threat. And it is about protecting Europe and deterring Russia from invading the rest of Europe. So this is something NATO knows how to do. It's sort of back to the original mission. And I think we sort of saw that sense of confidence.
That's the voice of Max Bergmann, the director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Collina and Lauren Billett.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, great to see you. How was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. Great to see you as always. My weekend was really great. I have 2 words for you: floral wallpaper. Unless that's 3. How was your weekend?
It was great. My one word, I don't know if this is one word, blueberries. It is blueberry season here in southern New Hampshire. So the blueberry bushes are blooming, which means blueberry pancakes and blueberry muffins. So what could be wrong? Tasty, tasty, fresh blueberries.
Well, I hope that you mail me some, but not to be a Debbie Downer, we do have to get into the nuclear news of this week, and there's not a lot of great stuff I hear. So why don't you tell us what's going on?
So this week marks the 7th anniversary of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which, as our listeners know, is now very close to collapse with the failure of the recent talks in Doha, and we'll have more on the Doha talks later in the show. This week also marks President Biden taking his first trip to the Middle East as president, and he will be stopping in Israel and Saudi Arabia. One focus of Biden's trip will be Israel's growing ties with Arab countries and an Arab-Israeli military partnership to counter Iran. So an obvious question is whether President Biden, which does he want more? Improved Arab-Israeli relations based on opposition to Iran, or saving the Iran nuclear deal, which we hope would reduce the threat from Iran? Can he have both? We will be watching the trip closely, as it can tell us a lot about where the Iran deal is going. Meanwhile, Iran announced on Sunday that it had started enriching uranium up to 20% at its Fordow nuclear site. Iran had previously announced it would do this, and this action could be reversed if the deal is revived. And switching gears for a moment to Russia, Moscow announced it deployed a submarine called the Belgorod, which is capable of launching the Poseidon missile, a long-range nuclear-armed autonomous torpedo. And this unique and terrifying weapon was first announced in 2015 as a way to get around U.S. ballistic missile defenses. By the way, those defenses are not effective against Russia's existing long-range missiles anyway, so it's not completely clear why Moscow wants this, but maybe Moscow is hedging against the future and the possibility of U.S. missile defenses increasing their effectiveness. Anyway, Lauren, tell us what you have lined up for early warning.
This week, Alex Hall sat down with Sanam Vakil, the Deputy Director of the Middle East North Africa program at Chatham House. They discussed how the last round of negotiations in Doha went and how the EU feels about the prospect of another round and returning to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal.
And then I sit down with Max Bergmann. He's the director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We discuss what happened during the recent NATO summit in Madrid and how NATO plans to shift its strategy to support Ukraine, integrate Finland and Sweden, and what all of this might imply for the future of the NATO-US relationship. It's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Jacqueline. After a 3-month pause, indirect talks between the U.S. and Iran to return to the Iran nuclear deal were held in Doha during the last week of June. Here to discuss this round of negotiations, I'm joined by Dr. Sanam Vakil, Deputy Head of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham House. Welcome, Sanam.
Thank you for having me.
So can you walk us through this last round of negotiations?
Yes, of course. The last round of negotiations in Doha provided a shift after a 3-month pause and were directed to bringing back greater momentum to the talks that had become stalled. The Qataris hope that by bringing the negotiating parties together for indirect talks, they could try to bridge some of divisive issues between Tehran and Washington.
So, what are those remaining sticking points that are preventing Iran and the US from returning to the deal?
Well, both sides for a number of months now have been saying they still want to get back to the deal. But the principal issue, I think, for Tehran is the issue of guarantees. For a few months, there were some demands by the Iranians that the US should lift the foreign terrorist organization designation off of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps. And when the Biden administration made it very clear that it wasn't going to lift that designation without some sort of shift in Iran's regional strategy, the issue of guarantees re-emerged as an unresolved issue for Tehran. And the reason why it's important, it really has to do with, let's say, Tehran's own vulnerabilities and issues with regards to time. Tehran is quite conscious that the US will be holding presidential elections again in less than 2 years, and mindful of Donald Trump's withdrawal from the JCPOA in 2018, they're very concerned that without guarantees that this JCPOA will remain just as fragile. And this is important within Iran's domestic context because the conservatives in power today and President Raisi were very critical of former President Rouhani for signing a weak deal and making Iran vulnerable. And so this team risks being taken down by the same criticism and the same vulnerabilities that their predecessors were criticized for.
So it's really interesting that the US and Iran also seemingly had different takeaways from this most recent round of negotiations, with the US saying there was no progress and Iran saying the talks were positive. Why do you think this is the case?
I think that both sides have different objectives. The Biden administration hopes that with pressure and multilateral pressure, they can make it clear to Tehran that time is really running out, and without greater momentum, this deal will die. And conversely, Tehran wants to demonstrate, again, optically and in the public domain, that it's interested in a JCPOA, and it gains a degree of credibility in keeping the negotiations alive, showing up for negotiations, also plays well within the public domain.
What do you expect to come next now that this round of negotiations has concluded?
That's a good question. We are in a bit of this limbo moment with not a great degree of clarity if there will be further negotiation. I think that we're in a bit of an wait and see moment. President Biden is going to the Middle East. He'll be making important visits to Israel and Saudi Arabia, and present at the GCC meeting in Riyadh. And I think after that visit, we'll have a greater sense of clarity about U.S. security commitments to its traditional partners in the region. And perhaps there might be a collective statement or call to support the revival of the JCPOA. But in absence of a slight shift or moderation on the U.S. side, or a slight shift or moderation on the Iranian side, the very clear reality is that the deal is dying. It is in nobody's interest to let this deal die now, with the war in Ukraine occupying so much time and capacity in so many capitals. But President Biden is also facing midterm elections, and he will be constrained. He won't be able to focus on such issues or prioritize them in any way. So where we are going, in absence of another round and serious effort to bridge the divides in both capitals, I think we're heading towards escalation, because plan B doesn't really exist, and escalation will see a return to more sanctions oversight and a return to Iran kicking up pressure to obtain leverage.
Thank you, Sanam. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but we'll keep following this closely and really appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
As the war in Ukraine rages on, NATO members met in Madrid last month to plan a united front to help Ukraine and to confront their old nemesis, Russia. They announced plans to beef up their defenses and that Sweden and Finland would join the alliance. And at the same time, Russia announced plans to provide nuclear-capable missiles to its ally, Belarus. Challenges lie ahead for NATO, such as how far should it go to support Ukraine and how to end a war that is already having significant economic consequences for both the United States and Western Europe. To help us understand how NATO is adapting to the new reality in Europe, we're joined by Max Bergmann. He is director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Max, it is great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom.
So let's begin with the big picture. This is the first time that NATO has updated its strategy in over a decade. How, in your view, have things changed in that time, and what at this summit did NATO say it was going to plan to do about it?
Well, I think it was past due for NATO to do this. And I think its 2010 strategic concept, its 2010 strategy, was outdated already in 2014 when Russia invaded Ukraine the first time. In 2010, it described Europe as a continent at peace and sort of projected that forward. It was also an era where we were focused on counterterrorism. We were focused on the war in Afghanistan, and the U.S. forces that still were fighting in Iraq at that point, still in 2010. So a very different era. This strategic concept, I think, treats Russia the way it should be treated, that Russia is an adversary of the alliance. The language is quite strong vis-a-vis Russia. It doesn't tear up the NATO-Russia Founding Act, which was a 1997 agreement, but it really puts Russia, I think, in its place as the major focus of the NATO alliance. And so in that sense, I think what we really see is sort of a back to the future sort of analogy here, where NATO is back to what it was founded for, which was in 1949 about European security, about deterring the potential Soviet threat. And it is about protecting Europe and deterring Russia from invading the rest of Europe. And so this is something NATO knows how to do. It's sort of back to the original mission. And I think we sort of saw that sense of confidence that NATO was operating in a space that was very tangible, very clear, and where it had a lot of experience and expertise throughout its 70-plus year history.
So what did they announce that they're planning to do that's different than what they were doing in the recent past?
Well, there are a number of big force posture announcements. The first is that they're going to upgrade essentially the battle groups that had been deployed to the eastern flank. So this is the enhanced forward presence, which essentially brings Western European forces to the Baltic states and other Eastern members, where NATO's concept after 2014 was that we would create a tripwire, where basically if Russia was going to invade the Baltic states, well, you would at least have to kill some Western Europeans. You'd have to kill some troops from the rest of the NATO alliance, which would reassure the Baltic states that these countries, that the rest of the alliance would come to NATO's defense, because you weren't just killing Estonian troops, you were killing French troops or Canadian troops. So this is going to increase that presence from a battle group to a brigade, roughly 3 to 4 times as large. And I think the other big announcement was to drastically expand something called NATO's reaction force, which is 40,000 troops up to 300,000. And what this essentially means is that NATO is supposed to have 300,000 troops that are ready to go. They're ready to roll if war is coming. And that's just certainly not the case right now, where many European militaries in particular are just not ready to fight. Their tanks aren't ready to roll, their ships aren't ready to sail, and their planes aren't ready to fly. That they have underinvested in the basic maintenance that is needed. They've underinvested in a lot of the training that is needed. And so you're seeing a lot of these kind of flabby militaries where they aren't ready to fight. And so this is, I think, NATO putting a real emphasis on military force readiness. And the third aspect is pre-positioning equipment. One of the things we're seeing in Ukraine is that you need to have a lot of arms to fight a war. It's not good enough to just have, some high-end systems on paper. That once they expend those weapons, like you need to have huge stockpiles of armaments to fight a war. And if we were going to be in a war with Russia, God forbid that ever happens, and it doesn't go nuclear, that we would be needing large quantities of munitions that currently Europeans don't have, and that we need to build up these stockpiles of pre-positioned equipment. So there's some big steps there in terms of NATO force posture. There's, of course, other announcements that were made by a number of different members that the United States is going to add more ships to Spain to increase its presence in the Mediterranean. I think an important signal to kind of U.S. presence in the Med. I think sent the right signal to the Eastern European countries and to Russia that NATO is going to shift from the kind of tripwire approach to defending every inch of NATO territory. That it's about really forward defense and deterrence, as opposed to, well, the Russians would come in and then we'd fight to take back the Baltic states. I think after the Bucha massacre, that simply isn't palatable to states on the front line.
Now, the troop increase you just mentioned is quite significant, and presumably it would not happen overnight. What kind of time frames are we talking about here?
Well, I think this is a big question. And, when we think about NATO's commitment in 2014, that every country agreed to reach 2% spending on defense. Well, this sort of looks a little bit like, to me, the next 2%, which it's good that we're now focused on troop readiness as opposed to sort of arbitrary and abstract defense spending numbers. But there's, I think, the one thing that NATO doesn't have, and this is, I think, oftentimes lost here in Washington, is NATO doesn't have the ability to spend money. That NATO is a multilateral alliance. It is up to the member states to spend money. And what that means is that when member states spend money, when European countries spend money, they're spending it on national defense. They're not necessarily spending it on European defense. And so who pays for European defense? Well, really, it's the United States that does. Well, various member states buy different assets and capabilities. And I think we are going to have a real problem where Europeans now need to modernize their militaries, improve their readiness, and, oh, by the way, provide all the support to Ukraine. When France is giving a quarter of its advanced Caesar howitzers to Ukraine, well, they have to replace that. That's not budgeted. And so Europe is about to spend 200 billion euros more collectively have been committed to spend on defense. But there's a big question of whether, A, that's enough, and B, whether it's going to be spent wisely. Because there's also a fourth element where we would like Europe to be able to do things without us, be able to have air transport planes so it could get troops from Portugal to Estonia and not rely on the United States, have air tankers so it could fly its fighter jets without the United States. Currently, it doesn't have these enabling assets because no European country on their own can afford them. And this is something that I think we need to look at how Europe can work together more. And this may be a role for the European Union, something the U.S. has long resisted.
So the U.S. and NATO, as we know, are providing significant military support to Ukraine. And both the United States and NATO say they will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, whatever that means. But the war is starting to cause a real economic pain across alliance members. So did the NATO summit talk about how long the alliance can stand together in support of the war? And is NATO at all thinking or talking about ways to bring the war to an end?
So I think there were a lot of commitments to Ukraine that were made during the NATO summit. I think one thing being at Madrid was very clear to me was the sense of unity that really permeated. I did not get a sense that the Europeans were going to go weak at the knee here. And I think your point is dead on, that the Europeans are paying a huge economic sacrifice. When we look right now at the inflation numbers in the US and Europe, they look identical, but the causes are very different. And the causes in Europe are really the war, are the dramatic increase in energy prices that the Europeans are facing, and that the Europeans in some ways have embraced the economic pain. That many of the countries in Eastern Europe have inflation that's even higher because they're more dependent on Russian gas. They're ripping the Band-Aid off. They are moving away from Russian dependence, and in putting in place really strong economic sanctions that have much greater impact on them than the sanctions that we're putting in place have on our economy. So Europe is taking a real economic hit. And I do think that one of the big questions is how do we support Ukraine economically for the long haul of this war? We think back to the war in Iraq, or the overseas contingency account that we had, we were spending roughly $10 billion a month for the war in Iraq. Wars are incredibly expensive. That's also why they're incredibly stupid. And that's why you shouldn't wage them. But this is not a war that Europe or Ukraine decided to get involved in. It's a war that Russia chose to initiate. And so I think it's incumbent upon Europe that Europe is taking all this economic pain. they need to figure out how to finance the war effort in Ukraine over the longer term. That we have done that to some degree with our Ukraine Assistance Act of more than 40 billion and providing more than 50 billion in assistance, and our military assistance is way higher. But the Europeans really need to figure out how they're going to sort of finance a long-term support for Ukraine, both economically, but also to provide Ukraine the military assistance, to essentially incentivize countries to say, hey, you're going to give away half of your howitzers or half of your tank fleet, but don't worry, you give that to Ukraine and you're going to be able to buy new ones. That's what we're doing, right? Our military is giving away equipment to Ukraine, but the Pentagon knows, generals know, that they're going to be able to buy new equipment because Congress has allocated the money. And Europe doesn't have that, and that's where I think the EU could play a role. We need to think financially how to kind of think about this in the long term.
So do you see NATO hanging together for the long term on the Ukraine war, or do you see cracks developing?
I would say two things. I would say, number one, I think we as the United States have strongly underestimated the Europeans' willingness to defend Europe and defend their union and defend the alliance. And oftentimes taking action that isn't progressive, that would create a lot of discomfort when you look at what was happening just last year in Belarus, where Belarus was trying to weaponize migration. They were incentivizing Iraqis to fly to Belarus and trying to send them across the border into Poland. And then you had Poland saying, basically setting up an iron curtain saying no migrants will be able to come across. People were dying at the border. And the European Union's response was to back Poland, right? Why? Because migration was seen as a grave threat to the political unity of the European Union. The EU is willing to do what it takes to defend its union. And I think will be willing to do what it takes to defend its union. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be able to mobilize itself to support Ukraine in the way it needs to or should. And I think this is where the United States needs to both lead, and that's what we're doing right now. That's what the Biden administration is doing. But I also think that's where we need to be constantly working with Europeans to encouraging them to say, hey, you should be doing more of this. You can be doing more of this, because they do have a collective action problem with 27 different member states in the EU. There's 30 NATO members. But I think NATO's role is fundamentally about strengthening and protecting NATO members. And I think that is what NATO is going to be focused on. And it is about supporting Ukraine, but that's ultimately at a bilateral basis, less at a NATO basis, because NATO doesn't have assets and resources that it can really pull upon. And I think what the US is doing by organizing donor conferences sort of outside of the kind of NATO structure does make a lot of sense. But this is going to be something that I think, it will be incumbent on Europe to maintain support for Ukraine, because the next phase of this war is really about, can Ukraine maintain the fight, given that its military has been ground down and it lacks a defense industry, and then what defense industry it has been pummeled by Russian missiles.
So let's talk about Finland and Sweden, who, of course, are the new rising members of NATO, and it does look like they will be accepted as new members. What are the next steps here? How long might this take, and how significant is this to the alliance?
So first, and this will, I think, please a lot of the arms control listeners out there, I think Finland and Sweden getting the green light from Turkey at the NATO summit is a clear example of why symmetry matters, why getting in the room matters. Ahead of the summit, talked to a number of U.S. government officials, European officials. No one expected this to happen. I was there at the summit. There was a lot of downplaying of any prospect that Turkey was going to essentially forego its veto and move this process along. The expectation that Turkey was going to obstruct for a long time. But instead, they got in the room. There was some real intensive back and forth. I think Turkey had realized that it had kind of played its hand, and that if it continued to try to extract more, then there was going to be potential real strong blowback against it. So I think it demonstrated, it was a real surprise. No one thought this was going to happen. And I think demonstrates the importance of face-to-face diplomacy. And also, Europeans did a very smart thing, and Sweden and Finland really, by not overreacting to Turkey's objections and not sort of going and attacking Turkey publicly, keeping everything quiet, engaging in really good, quiet diplomacy. But so what does this mean for the NATO alliance? I think it means a lot. I think, first, for both countries, this is a really big deal. For Sweden in particular, Finland, I think, always was very clear-eyed about Russia. They fought multiple wars against the Russians. They never took the peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. They didn't join the NATO alliance because they were worried about what Russia might do to it should it join. Sweden is sort of a different story. They have been militarily neutral for more than 200 years since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And I like to tell the story. There's this great Swedish Army museum in Stockholm. There's 2 floors in a room. The first floor is 1600, 1700. Second floor is 1700 to 1800. All these huge European wars, 30 Years' War, Charles XII, the Battle of Poltava. And then it ends. And then the next thing is about the Swedish defense industrial complex of the 20th century. Why? Because Sweden just was out of these European conflicts. But I think what Sweden saw in Finland is that Russia invaded a neighbor, that they didn't want to be isolated and alone in the one country that wasn't part of a broader security architecture. They saw after 2014 that Russia might take territory. They were very concerned about islands like Gotland in the middle of the Baltic, which are very strategic. And so Sweden began a massive rearmament over the last 8 years. But so this represents a real strategic shift. But both countries are very militarily capable. By joining the alliance, that I think the Scandinavian militaries together bring roughly 200 advanced fighter jets. That is a superpower-sized air force. So they are very capable. I think Finland having more than 1,000-kilometer border, large land forces is something that is creates a land border for NATO with Russia, but also for Russia with NATO. And that's something that Russia really has to think about. And it will enable greater integrated planning between the Scandinavia and the Baltic states. It really leads to NATO, I think, being more cohesive enterprise. The last thing I'd say, it ends the strategic ambiguity that basically existed with Finland and Sweden. That what would we have done if Russia did take military action? Would we have treated it like an Article 5? You don't want that ambiguity. In some ways, it can lead to miscalculation. And now I think there's real strategic clarity that Sweden and Finland will be part of the Atlantic Alliance. And at least in the interim, we have made strong security commitments to them to deter any Russian activity.
And now what does Russia do in response? Sort of treat it as a fait accompli and kind of downplay it because there's nothing they can do? What's their next step?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, that Putin has sort of treated this as a fait accompli. You saw a lot of verbose talk from lower level officials before Sweden and Finland made the formal announcement that they were going to apply to join. But I think there's a recognition that Russia has very little that it can do. Its military is not along the Finnish border right now. They are down south in Ukraine. So it doesn't have the military capacity to, I think, really threaten. Then number two, the potential use of hybrid threats against Sweden and Finland. Well, both countries are fully aware of this threat. They have been preparing, not just over the last 8 years, but particularly Finland, fully aware of the Russian playbook and have really built up a degree of societal resilience when it comes to cyber attacks, disinformation, and have intelligence services that are very focused on the potential for Russian penetration. So for a Russia that is distracted elsewhere, fighting a war against two countries that are very aware of what Russia can do from a hybrid standpoint, I don't think there is much that Russia can do. Now, of course, everyone looks at the activity that Russia did in 2016 vis-a-vis Montenegro, where it tried to initiate a political coup to try to dislodge its path towards NATO membership. But I think in the case of Sweden and Finland, that any Russian action, I think, would be seen as real provocation. Both countries would be, I think, strong enough to really push back on it. So I don't think there is much that Russia can do. And both the UK, France, US, and others have come and said, will you basically guarantee Swedish and Finnish security during this interim period?
Got it. Now, shifting gears for a second, another thing that this summit focused on was China as a diplomatic and economic threat, which seems odd given all that's going on with Russia. So tell us why the summit dealt with China at this point.
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of the summit, and it was quite striking, were the participation of American Asian allies at the NATO summit. The new Australian Prime Minister was there, leaders of South Korea, of Japan, and that this was a real demonstration, I think, of broader unity. And the Australian Prime Minister, who just started on the job, laid out in the NATO Public Forum, I think, a very clear articulation that, from his perspective, that what happens in Europe has real impact on the security in Asia and the Indo-Pacific. And what happens in the Indo-Pacific has real implications for the security of Europe. And so it's not possible to sort of create this sort of, you focus on that, we focus on this sort of division of labor, and that it's all tied together. Now, one of the big questions is, what does this mean of NATO focusing more on China? The language on China was quite strong in the strategic concept. It's quite clear that the United States really was pushing NATO to think more about China. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, his first trip to Brussels to NATO back in early 2021, mentioned China, I think, more than 10 times and barely mentioned Russia. So this has been a real focus. There is a big question of what does this actually mean? So what does it mean that NATO is going to focus more on the Indo-Pacific and on China? And I think that remains to be seen. I think right now, NATO's real task is to focus on the threat posed by Russia, the war in Ukraine, European security. But that said, France is an Indo-Pacific power. It has territory there. Europe's trade with Asia is really significant. Their ties to Asian economies. So in general, the way I see this is that a more capable NATO, where European countries are spending more on defense or building militaries that are quite capable, that are ready to deploy, that can move, that are able to move from their own countries to other countries, is something that could be very useful in a contingency related to the Indo-Pacific, and in general makes the US stronger and makes our Asian allies stronger, that if they could potentially, if something were to happen, they could call upon our European partners. The last thing I would just say on this is that I think the economic response done by Europe, the strength of that economic response in terms of sanctions, has to be somewhat of a wake-up call to China as well, because the view, I think, was a very sort of Marxist view that both Moscow and Beijing shared, that the sort of feckless Europeans and Americans would never sacrifice any economic growth for their values or geopolitical interests. And here we're seeing the exact opposite is true, that democracies, when pushed, are willing to take an economic hit to stand up for what's right and to stand up for their values. And I think Beijing has to see that, invasion of Taiwan would have real economic consequences for them as well.
So, Max, last question for you. Taking a step back, it's interesting to recall that just a few years ago, former President Trump was questioning why NATO even existed and was seeking to reduce U.S. financial support for NATO. And now the United States seems more committed to NATO than ever before. How important to you is this shift to both NATO and the United States?
Well, I think it's really significant. And I think in some ways, this is a high watermark probably for transatlantic relations, for the U.S. commitment to NATO, both in what we're doing in Ukraine, demonstrating the strength of American leadership, and the kind of value that is the requirement that Europeans have right now of a strong and engaged American military. That Europe would probably be able to muster a defense of itself without the United States, but it would not be nearly as capable without us. And I think there's a clear recognition of that the United States is an indispensable ally. Now, that said, it's not a given, and I think this must be clear to Europeans where the trajectory of the United States will go. And I don't just say this because maybe Trump will become president again, but the United States does face, two huge challenges from a military perspective, from Russia and from China. And when we think back to the 1990s Powell Doctrine of being able to fight two regional wars at the same time, and we essentially tried that out in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we saw is it really overstretched our military, despite the fact that we spend an incredible amount on our military. And so now we're facing with two superpowers. And I think it's only natural that what we're seeing is potentially a high watermark in transatlantic relations, because as the war goes on, hopefully it won't, but if it will, that attention has shifted toward China, and I think will continue to shift. And so the pivot to Asia was not a temporary phenomenon. It's not over. It's still ongoing. And the Asia hands are going to, reclaim, I think, the attention of senior policymakers. And so Europeans need to think about that. And it could also be that you then have a new American president that is just less transatlantically focused, less focused on maintaining strong European relations, gets annoyed that the Europeans are pushing things on climate or spending as much as we would like on defense or spending in the wrong way. So I think we need to take this moment. We need to embrace it. And then the United States should not just push to keep this and pretend that this is going to be the status quo. We need to push Europe in a direction where I think Europe can be able to stand on its own 2 feet, that Europe can basically handle more of its security on its own, is less dependent on the United States. That doesn't mean decoupling the United States from NATO, but it means we need to push Europe in a new direction, not just to be dependent on us, but to work more together, to integrate their militaries more, to work more with the European Union, use its financial clout, to think in more innovative ways about the future of European security. Because if we don't, then what we're going to be facing is frustration in a few more years, that we've sort of perpetuated a status quo where Europe is dependent on the indispensable United States, and we're annoyed that Europe remains so dependent. We want Europe, on the one hand, to stand on its own, but we want them to view us as indispensable. But what we need is a more balanced relationship. We need Europe to stand up and do more in the world. They're our critical partner. And in fact, if they do more in the world, I think what we would see is actually a stronger transatlantic alliance, a stronger NATO, in which we're working together more closely as equals more and less annoyed with each other, but more working as partners. So I think that's where we kind of need to pivot in how we think about the future. And hopefully that is where we'll go.
Max, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based band 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.